Yeah, and I think that's one of the primary messages of the book is that you describe children of the Immigration Act of 1965, which is definitely me and you, people whose highly
Right, right.
educated parents were let in when that was the preference. And then you have the more recent immigrants who don't think of themselves as Asian American, maybe often aren't engaged politically, they might not speak English very well. And there's a concern of the former group that's around cultural issues, representation in media, uh, politics, and the attempted creation of an Asian American political identity. And then there's the lived experience of the vast majority of people who don't have those experiences or advantages or that sense of collective identity. People who are more like your parents, maybe they identify themselves as Koreans in America or Cambodians in America or whatever the group happens to be. And that your recommendation is that Asian Americans in the former group, the educated group, should be taking on the true issues that are facing the latter group, which have been suffering in many ways, especially over the last number of months. Like that, your recommendation is to make common cause with that group, which, by the way, is probably larger. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the example that I give in the book and the one that I speak about quite a bit is that like after the Georgia spa massacres, right, which is this, traumatic experience, I think an extremely traumatic experience for a lot of Asian Americans. It was about a day of people talking about the actual tragedy. And then in the mainstream media and in all the messaging channels, like the conversation abruptly shifts, right? It becomes a lot of people like you and me, right, who sort of grew up with educated parents and went to good schools and now occupy these sort of elite places talking about ourselves, right? And what do we talk about? We talk about like microaggressions in the corporate workplace, right? We talk about the time when our
I certainly do
coworker
not try and
mistook us
talk
for
about
another
those, but
Asian
continue.
person. No, oh no, you did it. You did it. I said people who grew up like us, right? Who occupy these positions. And then I was thinking about it at the time, and I was like, well, why is this happening? These people are dead, right? These people are, you know, they are involved in sex work, which I'm not saying anything bad about sex work, but it's a precarious life, right? It's one that needs protection, right? They are all recent immigrants. Like they're not people who were born here in the United States. They're people who are living in extremely economically precarious conditions, right? They're not people who like are worried about the way in which they're treated at a diversity seminar, for example, at Google or something like that. And yet, these are the narratives that proliferate everywhere, right? Like the sort of upper middle class, like Asian spokesperson, Asian American spokespeople start to take over, and it becomes about them. And I think that is like I think that's a path to nowhere. You know, I think that it leads to zero solidarity with other groups, right? Like I think that it makes it so that other groups think that like our that all Asians have no problems except for what role Scarlett Johansson stole from one of us. It's like who wants to be in solidarity with a group like that, right? Like if those are the expressed concerns. And so the book is more about like, or the argument that you're talking about in the book is just that like, look, we need to start thinking about people who are actually less fortunate. We have to think about these immigrant communities. We have to think about the people in Georgia who we say we care so much about, but also are erasing from this narrative almost immediately and replacing with us, right? And so I think that's a very difficult thing to do, but I don't really see any other pathway for like whatever this thing that we call Asian American identity
Oh,
is.
I'm going to suggest another pathway. You might not like it, but I'm just going to throw this
Okay.
out there. Uh, so in a way, it's like Ronnie Chang's recommendation, where he talked about how we're going to be the referee. But
Yeah.
so you have a country that's coming apart, and I'm going to propose that Asian Americans become the glue, that we become the unifying group that's trying to solve the real problems, keep everyone together. And when you talk about who we fight for, I mean, I love the idea of trying to uh, elevate and embrace the cause of recent immigrant workers. In part, because I mean, they remind me of my family and everyone. I'm sure, like a lot of people,
Right.
feel the same way. But I want us to try to make the country whole, to see like America's interests as ours, and say to folks too that if the reverse is true, if this country disintegrates, which by the way it's on track to do, it's going to be terrible for everyone. But it's going to be terrible for us. That's my case. I don't know what you think.
I think that there's a lot of Asian people who could fill that role, right? And it's like something that I think like I don't know, it's something that Wesley Yang writes about too, right? Where he talks about how like, like the Asian male is sort of like the every male, right? Because like he doesn't really find any identification with any sort of culture, and so he just becomes sort of the default, right? Like I think that there is some in that, but I also just think that like I don't know. Can you really like? Do you think these immigrant populations are going to get right? Like I guess I'm just having a hard time picturing like how they would be mobilized in that sort of way, right? How they would see it in their best interest.
Well, if you look at these immigrant populations, and you described in your book about your parents, it's like these came in and just wanted to make a
Right.
living. It's like wanted to
Right.
like
Right.
get a decent life, and I think that's what motivates a lot of folks. In a big way, to me, I want to create the conditions where that still is true for people who show up, and they don't need to worry about being Asian and getting beaten up in some way. It's like a functional America. It allows them to fulfill that ambition, I suppose.
Right. Right.
I,
Yeah, I guess I just think for me the political work is always just going to be about figuring out ways to have solidarity with other groups, right? And specifically like Black and Latino groups, right? Like in America. And I think that for a lot of Asian Americans who are, in my position, for example, where they're okay financially and but they are always trying to think about themselves, how am I going to fit within this progressive space, right? I think those Asian Americans don't necessarily care about what white people think about them. I don't really care what white people think about me. I'm 41 years old. I'm sort of over that, right? I think that the thing that those Asian Americans think about quite a bit, though, is what Black people think about them, right? Like how, because they see that as the only way to sort of have a type of solidarity and type of politics that they can be proud of, right? And that I think that that's why there's so much sort of like care around some of these issues, around these attacks, for example, right? Like people are really, really upset about saying something that they feel will be treasonous to that type of solidarity. Now, the contention I make in the book is that that sort of solidarity is very fraught, right? Like that outside of places like the academy or outside of places like, I don't know, corporate boards or something like that, or diversity spaces, like it's very difficult to say that it's there, if we're having an honest conversation about it.
in the New York mayoral race, a new phrase was coined, which someone used people of color, and then someone said, well, like, Yang's of color, and they were like, no, people of more color.
Right. And it seems like every day a new term is created to sort of like push Asian people out of like this coalition, right? And so I think that my sense is just like we need to just kind of be honest about that, right? And if our goal, which I think should be our goal, like I mean this totally, like this is like the purpose of my life's work basically, is like, can we build meaningful coalitions with those people? Can we have meaningful solidarity with like Black and Latino
But
people?
when you say that, I
need
would say, can we build meaningful coalitions with people, with anyone? Like, I'd take anyone.
Right, sure. But for me, it really is like a center around like like what would be like a sort of politics of dissent, right? Like I'm much more to the left than you politically, right? So and I would just say that you need to start doing work that resembles work that other people are doing, right? And I think that there are a lot of Asian American activists who are doing this type of work right now, right? They're totally ignored, right? They're sort of, but they're doing work that's like kind of like helping laundry workers or helping bike messengers, whatever.
Like Ijen Poo comes to mind.
Delivery drivers. Right. And I mean, I think that like early on, like when you're in your like 20s or something like that, you're pretty involved in this sort of stuff, weren't you? Or like you're involved in Asian American spaces, right?
Yeah, quite a lot.
Yeah, so like I think that I just think that would be a much more appealing type of work for people to do. It'd be more satisfying, but at the same, and I think that it would have a lot of overlaps with the type of work that like coalitional Black Latino activists are doing as well. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have all this be determined by activists, right? A lot of this is just work in your daily life, and I think that's the only path, right? But it's difficult. It's difficult. Like the end of the book is me just sort of expressing my own doubts that this will ever work, right? Like that, because we're so incentivized by capitalism. Yeah.
Well, I the takeaway I took was you present a couple of different choices, and then you're like, well, we kind of need to forge our own identity, our own path, which is something I agree with.